Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be able to join you. Good evening, everybody. The work that I do with my lab team is focused on learning. I first had an interaction with artificial intelligence, and this might give away how old I am, in the 1990s. And we were using a tool called ELIZA. Anybody heard of ELIZA? Some of you heard ELIZA. So ELIZA was first introduced to the world in 1967. That was well before I was born. And what ELIZA did, for those of you who don't know, is that it was kind of like a chatbot that was meant to work like a counsellor, right? Like you go and see a counsellor who might help you with a mental health issue. It wasn't very sophisticated, it wasn't very good, but the reason that we were using that is that we were trying to understand how the brain works, right? So we were using technology as a way to understand the brain. What has happened is that more and more the technologies that we see in AI are built on neural networks. So it's now kind of the other way around, that technology looks more and more simulating kind of supposedly how our brains work. So hopefully while I'm talking, you'll start to think of some questions that you might want to ask. If you've got technical questions, I'm not the person to answer those, because I'm interested and my team are interested in the human side of all of this. What does this mean for humans? What does it mean for human learning? And what can we understand about the human-machine interaction that is going to help us to get a sense of how these new technologies might help with learning? So that's what I'm going to try and walk you through this evening. The other part of this is that I am also a teacher, and some of what I'm going to talk about will come from my perspective as a teacher. I teach future teachers. So my students are going to be primary and secondary teachers at some point in the future. So I'm also thinking about the issues that generative AI in particular raises on the basis of the fact that I am also teaching, and thinking about that, how that might impact my own students. So let's start by talking very broadly about AI in education and what is currently happening in this area. So we know, many of you will be familiar with this, you've come to a talk in the evening on AI, that there has been a lot of discussion about the potential role of generative AI in education, including, some very high profile people. Sal Khan, who came up with Khan Academy, that many of you will be familiar with, and many, many others have been involved in this work. However, there is also increased skepticism about the role that AI might play in learning. And some of what I'm going to talk about tonight will help give you a sense of why there is some skepticism out there, right? These tools were not built for learning, right? They were built for other purposes, productivity, marketing, and other types of activities. They were not built to help us to learn. Right? And I think that that's very important to keep in mind here. It's not a purpose-built technology for learning. So we need to adjust how we use it. We need to make sense of it. We need to think about the ways that it's going to impact on what we do in our learning very carefully, because there are some pretty major downsides that are emerging in terms of the impact that this technology is having on learning. I will also say that there are some enormous opportunities. Right? And I'll talk a little bit about the opportunities and how we can make the most out of this technology in our learning. While I'm not an expert in the technology side of this thing, I have been using these tools a lot. I work with people who have been using these tools almost constantly since they came out over 2 years ago. And we are starting to find some real opportunities for this technology to help you to learn. All right? And I'll talk a little bit about that. The other part of all of this is obviously that the technology itself is changing. New technologies like DeepSeek emerged not that long ago, and we are constantly seeing an evolution of these tools and technologies over time. They're being upgraded, they're doing new things, there are different versions of these technologies. So I don't want to dismiss that this is a constantly evolving space. Right? That's a really important part of all of this as well. Don't know what's happening in North America today. It's happening so quickly that I haven't been able to keep up. If anybody can tell me what is happening in America today, I'm sure there is some big story something that's happened there. But before, the entire Department of Education was going to be shut down, there was a lot of discussion about very widespread use of these technologies across universities and university systems. Right? So there is a lot of emphasis on using, in this case, OpenAI, and other kinds of tools across these large education sectors. So there's a lot of emphasis on this. Right? Education is one of the big areas that people are talking about in terms of where AI is going to have some sort of impact. As many of you will be aware, much of the talk so far, and it's particularly true in my context in Australia, is that we have been worried about these tools and how they might be used to cheat. Right? Take shortcuts in learning, and we have to have had a very serious discussion about aspects of academic integrity. I'm going to try and move a little bit away from that tonight because I think that we also need to ask some really fundamental questions about learning. But I don't want to ignore that there is an issue out there about the potential of using these tools in the wrong way. There is also a lot of opportunity to use them in the right ways. Okay. Let me give you some sense of what I kind of think that this tool, this is a nice analogy that will give you a sense of what I think it does for our minds and our brains. So before there was any such thing as an e-bike, if you wanted to ride somewhere, you would ride there, and as a result of that, you would also get a little bit fitter. Right? Ride a bike, you'd have to pedal on it, and as a side effect of that, going from A to B would help you to develop your fitness. Now, e-bikes came along, and if you really want to, the good e-bikes these days, you really don't have to pedal at all. But if you think that you're going to get onto an e-bike and get fit, you're not. In the same way, learning before generative AI came along or before some other technical tools came along required work. Right? If you wanted to get to the end of a degree or you wanted to get to the end of your studies, it required work. Right? And that work is an important part of the process of your brain and your mind becoming better at doing what they need to do. Now we have generative AI here. You don't necessarily have to pedal in learning at all. Right? We can get generative AI to do a bunch of the work for us. What I'm going to try and help you to understand tonight is why the work of learning matters. We don't want it to be like an e-bike. The work is kind of the bit that is important. Right? So in many ways, your brain is kind of like your body in that the more effort we put into our learning, the more you will get out of it. So we have to think very carefully about how we might use AI in learning so that that effort doesn't disappear. Right? And I'm going to walk you through why that's particularly critical. No e-bikes for the mind. All right. So what's the potential for your learning here? Seen one of these? Many of you will see one of these before. A lot of people talk about how generative AI is like a calculator. Right? It's kind of not really. Here's why. Here's our calculator here. Here is Google's Gemini. Right? The calculator, right, can you just pick that up and use it? What do those symbols mean? Right, if you've never been exposed to mathematics before, how are you going to know what those symbols do? Right? What about if you've never seen the numbers before? Well, hopefully you will have seen some numbers before, but you need to understand something about mathematical operations in order to use a calculator. Right? In order to use a generative AI tool, you don't necessarily have to have any domain knowledge to engage with it. Right? You don't necessarily need to know about the thing that you're about to look up. Right? You can just go in there and you can start using it. Right? So the barrier to using these tools is very different. There is a barrier here. You need to understand some maths concepts. Here, you don't necessarily need to understand anything. Right? So that's an important difference. I still don't understand what a bunch of those buttons do, which is a bit embarrassing. But that is the limit of my mathematical knowledge. Right? So that's the first difference. The second difference, a calculator won't explain to you how to use it while you're using it. Right? There's some really fancy calculators that you can buy these days that might do a bit of that, but generally they don't. Right? They're a very transactional tool. You put some stuff into it, you get an output, and off you go. Right? It's the kind of thing that won't give you instructions on how to use it while you're using it. Generative AI will. Right? So I won't ask you to put your hands up, but I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you have used a generative AI tool of some description at some point here. And you may very well be on top of this already. But one of the things that I learned to do very early on is rather than trying to guess what kind of prompt I need to come up with, I just ask it. Right? I'm trying to do this thing. I'm trying to brainstorm some ideas for a task that I'm trying to do. What kind of prompt should I give you to get the best results? So you can ask this technology here to tell you how to use it effectively while you're using it. The other tip I would give you there and one of the first things it told me is don't ask for one idea, ask for 10. Right? Again, many of you will be on top of this, but I think it points to the difference between these two technologies. Right? One of them helps you to understand how to use it while you're using it. The other one doesn't. The third way, and I think probably the most profound in all of this, and the one that we'll focus on a little bit here in our discussion, is that one of these technologies is very transactional. It's just a tool. You put something in, you get something out. The other one acts more like a collaborator. Right? So how do we know that this is the case? For those of you who have used generative AI, did you feel or did you actually go in and say please and thank you while you were using it? Right? Do you say please and thank you to a search engine? Do you say please and thank you to your laptop? Yet for many of us, we feel like we should be saying please and thank you to generative AI. Right? It's still a technology. It's still a technology that we're having an interaction with, but there is something about the dynamic of this technology that makes us feel like we need to treat it differently. Right? Perhaps that could be we're worried about it taking over the world and killing us all. We don't want to get in trouble with our new robot overlords. But I think more fundamentally, it feels different because it is different. Right? It's a technology that works more like a peer or a collaborator rather than a tool. But at the same time, it still is a tool. Right? It just doesn't feel as much like a tool. So that provided us some clues, right, for things that are really quite fundamentally different here. My colleagues and I wrote about this a little while ago, and this, I think, holds very well, despite the fact that the technology has changed a little bit. What I want to give you a sense of is the different ways in which we can use technology in learning, right? We'll start with the simplest one here. So we can either offload or we can extend, right? Offload or extend. And I'll tell you what the difference is there in a second. We can either do this at an individual level, in which case the technology is kind of like a tool, or we can do this in a more collaborative sense, right? So as I was just saying, a technology that operates more like a peer, right, or a colleague. So let's start with the ones we're familiar with before we get onto the AI side of this. For a calculator, what we tend to do with a calculator is that we just offload. Right? I don't want to calculate this. It's too hard for me to calculate this. I couldn't be bothered calculating this. I'm too tired. I just want the answer here. I put my calculation into the machine, I get the response, and I go about my day. Right? It's transactional. It's a tool. We had that kind of offloading, get the response, off we go. Right? Now you can use generative AI like that. Right? That is one way that you can use it. Is it using it to its full potential? That is the question. Now, if we think about a technology that we're using like a tool, if we're using it to extend our capabilities, this is different, but it's different in important ways. So if I'm going to use a technology to extend what I'm doing, I'm allowing the technology to create more capacity for me to be able to do something. Right? So one of the really good examples of this is how we use technology to store phone numbers. Right? I barely remember my own phone number anymore. When I was a kid, I used to remember lots of people's phone numbers because I had to. There was no way to extend my memory capability to a machine in an efficient way to do that. Right? We used to have to look up big, nasty phone books and things like that. Right? What my phone allows me to do is extend my memory beyond what I could do just in my head. Right? So it's a very different dynamic to just offloading. The other thing, that obvious example of this, is mapping. Right? If you follow Google Maps or any sort of map program, you still need to kind of think about how you navigate around the environment, but that map allows you to extend that capability by having some sort of directions that you might follow. Now, you could take that too far and just follow Google Maps without having any sense of direction whatsoever, and often you get lost, right? So it still requires some capability for you to be able to navigate the environment, but it allows us to extend our navigation capabilities. Subtle but important distinction there between those two. Okay, so now if we think about what this looks like when we have a technology that works more like a collaborator or a peer, when we offload, what we're doing here is that we're allowing the machine to help guide us through the task. All right, so that's why we call this a co-regulation. What we mean by that is that I'm working together with the machine as a collaborator to get the task done in a cooperative way. Let's say that you're stuck on an assessment, on a particular assessment task. Let's say that you're trying to do an essay. Right? Probably all had to go at an essay at some point, and you get stuck on something. Right? Now, what you can do, and many of you will have figured this out already, is you can put that essay in, keeping in mind that it's going to potentially suck your data up into the cloud somewhere, so be careful with that. But you could potentially put the essay that you've got so far in and ask a machine to give you feedback on that. Right? How am I going here? What are some suggestions about things that I could do here? You could ask it to grade your essay for you. What score would you get out of 100 here? And what do I need to do next? Right? This is not getting the machine to do it for you. This is using the machine to help guide how you might move forward. All right? So it becomes much more like that collaborator where I'm partly offloading the way in which I go about the process. This is where we start to see some really powerful use of this technology. I've used generative AI for this purpose before. It's not writing for me. It's looking at what I've done and providing me feedback and then going through cycles where I can improve my work. It's still my work. It's still my intellectual property. Just make sure if you do this in your own learning that it doesn't violate any of the policies in your units or, in your schools or anything else. But I'm not asking it to write for me. I'm getting it to help me to write better. Right? So very different to the sort of thing that a calculator can do. The last one, and this is where we start to see some potential so far, but we've still got some more work to do on this, is when a generative AI tool becomes a way that we can do tasks and perform in a way that is beyond what we could do or the machine could do. Right? So this is where we're extending our capabilities by using AI to do things even better again. Right? It's early days for that one, but the point of this one is that we can have outputs here that are beyond what humans or machines could do on their own. Right? So there's enormous potential in that area when we really start to get that happening. There is a lot of work happening in Europe at the moment on this idea of hybrid intelligence or hybrid learning. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what that might look like, but there are some early clues that that's a really powerful way of going about doing this. Right? I'm extending my capability to learn by using the technology to help. Does that make sense? All still with me? How are your cookies going? Everybody had their cookie? Okay, so that's the 4 different ways in which we think that this technology could work. Now, what's actually happening? What's actually happening? So I'm going to give you a sense of some data that we've collected, or not that we've collected, that we've looked at from around the world. So this is towards the end of last year, and this is a constantly shifting space. So when we did this review, it was in the latter part of 2024, and it was looking at how generative AI is being used by students in both secondary school contexts and tertiary contexts, mostly higher education and mostly universities. Right? Most of the studies have been done in universities, but there are some secondary school studies emerging as well. So what's happening here? And you can put yourself in one of these categories. At that stage, and remember this also includes secondary, about 25% of students are not using it. Now, for a lot of secondary school contexts around the world, they are still being told not to use AI. Right? They're still supposedly banned. They're not really, because students just go home and use it. We know that that's happening, but officially 25% of students not using it. Now, there's lots of reasons. It's because it's not something that they're supposed to be accessing. They don't see the value of it. Some students are scared that they're going to get in trouble for cheating. But there's lots of different reasons why students are not using these tools in this group. Right? It's about 25% across secondary and tertiary. About 40%. Again, this may not be any of you in the room because you've come to a talk on AI, but about 40% are using it transactionally. What do we mean by that? So transactional use is using AI kind of like we use the other technologies, kind of like the way that we use our phone or a Google search or a calculator, in that often what this use looks like is that a student will go in and do it, use an AI tool like a Google search, right? I need an output of some kind, I put something in, I get the output and off I go, right? It's very transactional like a calculator, right? So that leaves 35%, right, and this group's growing all the time, who are using these tools in more complex ways, more like a peer, more like a collaborator, right? So we're seeing more and more students using these tools in this way. However, when we start to ask what it's actually being used for, and we've done some lab studies on this to try and see what actually happens in use over time, one of the biggest ones, and you might find this yourself, explaining things. Yeah? It explains things really clearly, often, sometimes gets it wrong. Right? Anybody find that this is one of the reasons I like to use AI? Because it's really good at explaining stuff? Yeah? If you haven't played around with this, one thing you can try is, I don't know anything about quantum physics, I'm not a physicist at all, but you can ask it to explain quantum physics to you as though you're a 7-year-old, right? It's pretty good at doing that stuff, but it sometimes gets it wrong, and we know that. Brainstorming ideas. Right, this is another good one. And like I said before, one of the secrets here is to not ask for one idea, ask for 10. Right? Some of them are going to be terrible. Some of them might be good. Right? I find for me personally, and I have a very specific job to do in my day-to-day work, but this is one of the ways that I find myself using AI quite a lot. Right? I need to teach something I haven't taught for a while. Give me 7 ideas for how I might be able to do that effectively or in a new way or a creative way. Right? I understand that I'm not being very creative by asking a machine to do that for me, but it's good at generating some ideas. And as a teacher, I can look at that and go, those 3 are not going to work for me, but here's a couple that might work, and I might do something that is a mix of these 2. Right? So coming up with new ideas, it's great. If you're trying to move knowledge forward, so a big part of my job, and this is where I think we find some of the risk, a big part of my job is to try and create new knowledge. Right? That's what my team are doing. We're trying to understand all of this. It's not very good at doing that, right? These tools are built on averages. If you're trying, so if you're a master's student or you're pushing towards a kind of PhD level where your job is to come up with new knowledge, there is going to be a limit in terms of how much it's going to help you be creative with that, right? Just simply because of the way that it works and what's in its database. So unfortunately for me, it's not very good at writing grant applications, because it's not very creative in that regard in terms of pushing the frontiers of new knowledge. You can think about whether or not you think this is true. Right? Globally, across secondary and tertiary contexts, the average is about 10 to 15% of students who admit that they are using AI to write their assignments. The number of students who actually use AI to write their assignments is probably a different number. But we don't know. Right? And there's no very clear estimate about what this looks like. Right? So about 10 to 15%. Right? Now, some of that writing might be absolutely appropriate, right? Depending on what the circumstances are. Some of it might be completely inappropriate. Right? Some of it we might call taking a shortcut or cheating. So there are some interesting patterns starting to emerge here. We think of this as being kind of 3 thresholds of use, right? And until you pass this threshold, it's kind of tricky to see what the next way in which you could use this technology might look like. So let's start with the first one. The first one is what I said before, kind of using it like a calculator or using it like a Google search, right? It's being very transactional about it, right? The second one is where you're kind of doing what's on the label: ChatGPT, chat, interact, get some feedback, go back and forward with it, right? You will get much more use out of these technologies if you engage in a conversation with it. That's what they're designed to do, right? So that's the second threshold. And it's interesting that there are people who are even working in this space and been thinking about this for a while that still haven't quite cottoned on to that idea that this is an interactive technology that works like a collaborator. Right? It's an important distinction, but once you pass that threshold, then you get some really much more sophisticated ways of this helping you with your learning. Like I said before, it can provide feedback on your work, suggestions, help you to move forward in your learning, particularly if you're stuck on something. The third one, and this is one that I'm not even sure that I've crossed myself, is that some people, including some students and some others that we've talked to or that we've seen in some of the data that's been collected, are using AI in a much more sophisticated, complex way. Now, what does that look like? So you might know some of these people if you get a chance to sit next to somebody who has spent thousands and thousands of hours using AI, and there are generative AI, and there are people out there who have done this. They're often not using one tool, they're using multiple tools in really deeply engaged ways at various points in a workflow to get tasks done, right? So they will draw on one tool to do one particular bit, they'll go away, they'll pull something together using another AI tool, and then those components will be brought together using a third different approach. And this is going to look very sophisticated and it's going to look quite different depending on the kind of task that they're trying to do. Now, I have an example where I have sat next to somebody who can do this very well. This person on their phone in 30 seconds created a video of themselves saying a script with background graphics and all sorts of other things going on. He never said any of those things. Everything was entirely generated by generative AI on his phone in 30 seconds. He created a video where he was explaining a concept, like an image. So he'd uploaded a video of himself from somewhere else. It was entirely deep faked, right? But he was able to do that using a sophisticated workflow in less than a minute. It's pretty impressive to watch people who have kind of really got the hang of this. And some of you are probably in this category. Right, so that's the sort of third threshold where we start to see these things deeply integrated into workflows to get things done in really complex, sophisticated ways. Eventually, we'll probably all get to a use that looks something like this. If you're not there yet, don't stress, neither am I. All right, my job is to understand humans and not necessarily to spend my whole day playing with AI. Right? But if you get the chance, as I said, if you get the chance to sit next to somebody and watch what they can do with these tools who have spent thousands of hours with them, it's pretty impressive to watch. That's the kind of third threshold here. So we're talking about this within a kind of what we call a network of co-regulation. And let me kind of simplify what this looks like. So for you as students, that's you in the middle there, believe it or not. We've spent a lot of time, and you may have heard a whole lot of discussion about what a student is doing with an AI, right? And some of what I've talked about here is really about that. We've interviewed hundreds of students now. Now, admittedly, they're in our context, so we have to keep that in mind in what I'm about to say. We've interviewed hundreds of students now about how they really use these sorts of tools in their learning. Now, for that third group that I just talked about, the ones who are pretty good at this, right? What was interesting is that their use is integrated into a whole lot of different ways in which they're currently learning. And if you're using AI, you're probably doing a bit of this as well. But students who are really good at doing this, including no doubt many of you, have a way of being able to navigate this environment really effectively with them at the centre and then all of these other resources around them. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. So let's say our student in the middle here is stuck. Right? They're stuck on something in their learning and they're not quite sure how to move forward. Right? They don't quite understand a particular concept or other. What many of the students told us, and again, these are students from my context, is that the first place they will go is to AI because they generally get a very clear explanation of what it is that they're trying to understand. It's clear, it's fluent, it's easy to understand. However, they also know that generative AI isn't always right. So again, what some of these students who are really good at doing this told us is that the next place they go is to the internet, right? To check, to make sure that they're not being told that the way to stick cheese to a pizza is to use glue, right? Or to eat rocks for their health, right? Some of the things that we know are quite famous mistakes that generative AI has made. What was interesting from there is that a lot of students also told us that they still like, and again, you can think about whether this relates to you, they still like video resources, podcasts, multimedia. Right? Anybody here watch some videos in their learning? Watch lots of videos? Who watches them at 1.5 speed? Right? Double speed or something, right? All right, so that is still a big feature of their learning. And it sounds like for quite a number of you in the room, that is still a big part of it. Obviously, and this came up earlier today, what you get from a generative AI is often, not always, but often text-based. This is obviously provides opportunities for visuals and various other ways of, more deeply understanding what it is that you're trying to understand. So videos and podcasts and other components like that also play a big role. So far, you notice that this student hasn't interacted with another human, right? And they certainly haven't interacted with us up the top as teachers. I still don't have a wand, I'm waiting for mine, but there is a point beyond this where this starts to get interesting. And again, you can think about whether this relates to you, where the students that we spoke to told us that they no longer want to interact with the technology, they want to interact with a human. Right? There is something fundamental about that human interaction that they wanted to kind of shift to at some point. The interaction with the machine just wasn't satisfying, wasn't helpful, and they needed to test their knowledge in some way with another human. Right? For our students that we spoke to, the way that they would initially do that, and we were surprised about this, is through Instagram Messenger. Right? Now, you might have a similar situation here where you're talking to other students via some other platform, right? But it was often a chat forum of some kind, a private chat forum. Then from there, they might go to a bigger group and eventually they might end up asking us as the teacher if they still can't get past it. My point here is that everything that we have come to understand about the students who are good at doing this, it's not about how well they understand the machine. Right? You need to know a little bit about how to get started. But like I said, generative AI helps explain to you how to use it while you're using it. What mattered is that these students were good learners first. Good learners first, then became good at using AI because they were able to fit it into all of the other resources that they had around them that were helping with their learning. Right? Good learners first, good learners with AI second. Right? Over and over again, we've had that message reinforced. So what does that actually mean to be a good learner? A lot of students also told us that they use AI to make learning easier, to make learning faster. Kind of like an e-bike. You can go faster, it'll be easier, but you're not going to get fit. Right? That's the kind of trick here. Easy and fast is not necessarily the best way we want to learn. Right? The conversation, like I said, has been a lot about cheating, but we, my colleague and I, have talked about how we have to start thinking more about learning. Right? We have to rethink what it means to be a good learner. This is the acute and the chronic problems, but I think really it comes down to the biggest problem that we've got over a longer term is what does high quality learning look like now? The World Economic Forum a few weeks ago released a report and they said essentially that the greatest skill that you can have in the age of AI is to be a good self-regulated learner, because we're going to all have to keep learning, relearning, unlearning, learning more as this goes on because things are changing so rapidly. Right? So being a good learner, this is the World Economic Forum, is saying that being a good learner is potentially the greatest skill that you can have for your careers and for your lives. I would agree because I study learning, but I think it's good to hear these big international organisations saying the same thing. It's not prompt engineering. It's not understanding how computers work. It's being a good learner. Thankfully, that's an actual visualisation of a brain, believe it or not. That is a visualisation of blood flow patterns in somebody's brain in real time. Live brain visualisation of where the blood is going while they're doing a task of some description. The good news is that in the last 20 or 30 years, we have learned more about how the brain and mind learn than we have in the entire recorded history before that. There's still a lot we don't know, but we know quite a lot about what good learning should look like. And hopefully this will be helpful. One of the really important things that we've learned is that the learning that matters is hard. Right? This is what I mean by your brain being quite a lot like getting fit. Right? So education is kind of like going to a personal trainer. It's not like Netflix, right? You can't pay your money and get learning. Right? Learning is a partnership between us as teachers and you as students. And what we're trying to do is help you to get fitter in your mind in the same way that you might get fitter in your body. The harder you work, the better you get at it. Right? There's no avoiding that. All of the research that we've had, that we've looked right down into what's going on in people's brains, it all says the same thing. Learning hard matters, right? It's what makes a real difference. If you don't believe me, here's some of the most important work in this area. This is a good summary of this. It's this area called desirable difficulties. A desirable difficulty is something that is hard in your learning process that helps you to learn something because it is challenging. Right? Now, this might not be the message that you want to hear, but this is what all of the research is telling us over and over. Difficulty in learning is desirable. Unfortunately, the downside of this is, for many of us, and if you put me, I've been doing this for many years, and if you put me in a situation where I have to learn something that I don't really want to learn, I'm going to try and resist it. Right? I'm going to try and get out of having to do it. I'm going to try and get out of having to do the hard work. But the hard work, like getting fit, is kind of the most important bit. Right? There is no easier or faster here, unfortunately. A lot of what we want to make sure is that it's also something that you're not miserable about. All right. So I'm not saying it should always be awful and horrible and not engaging and, something that you have to kind of get through despite all of the horrible, terrible things that you might need to do. We also want to make sure that you're able to use various tools in your learning, that they are interesting, that you can engage with them. All right. So there's a bit of a balance going on there as well. As I alluded to a minute ago, the key here is really about being a good self-regulated learner. All of the research, we've looked at 60,000 students. Now we've got over 6 million data points, and time and again, it tells us that this is the most critical skill here. What do I mean about being a self-regulated learner? Whenever you're learning, there's kind of two parallel processes going on. One is that you're actually doing the basic learning stuff, the thing that we always focus on. I'm trying to learn this concept or this idea. Right? I'm trying to get this task done. Well, whatever you're doing that, you are also constantly looking at how you're going, making some sense of how you're going, and then making some decisions about where do I need to go next. There is a metacognitive level that we would say is existing on top of that. You need to make a judgment about how you're going, and then you need to decide where you're going to go next. Right? Now, this can go wrong. So let's say you might have done this, I've done this, right? Just one day I had this kind of thing in my head. It was like, how do volcanoes work? I don't know. Let's find out. So I read a Wikipedia page. It was very clear. It had lots of pictures. It was really amazing. And by the end of it, I thought that I was an expert in volcanoes. I wasn't. I had no idea, right? So while the learning had happened, the way in which I understood my level of learning wasn't aligned, right? There was a misalignment there. So the better we get at this, the better our learning is. If you think about what an expert is in whatever area it is that you're studying, an expert isn't just somebody who knows a lot, they also know what they don't know. Right? And that's really important. So experts are good at knowing how much they know about something, not just that they have a lot of knowledge. Right? That's what it means to be a good learner. It's really important. So you're making good judgments about how you're progressing, you make good decisions about where to go next. And it is one of the important things that we know that machines are not particularly good at helping us with. Right? They can provide some, like I said before, some scaffolding to help move us forward, but all of the work, so this is based on some research that we've done, AI can simulate certain things pretty well. Right? So these are some of the most important kind of critical thinking skills that are really critical to a lot of the work that we do in higher education. There are some of those things like basic interpretation or analysis that machines are very good at simulating already. We've already heard that a lot of people are telling us that they like the way that AI explains things. Right? What it's not so good at doing is things like evaluating stuff, making sense of things, which is what we mean by inference. So making sense of things in the world. And it's not very good at all at regulating itself because it doesn't have a metacognition, right? It's not a conscious being. You have a metacognition. That's one of your superpowers. How's everybody going? The sugar worn off now from the cookie? We need another cookie. Everything that we've done is pointing to this idea of self-regulated learning as being fundamental to what is going to give you a successful career in life and is going to help you in your studies. Right? Very important. So what do we do about all of this? One of the things is that we have to accept, this is a relatively recent paper that came out towards the end of last year, we have to accept that hard work is often unpleasant. Hard mental work is unpleasant. Right? Is there anybody here who likes getting on a rowing machine and sitting on that for an hour and pulling on it? Some people like that, but usually they're pretty fit to start with. Right? In the same way that many of us will avoid having to do hard work to get fit, we also tend to avoid to do the hard work of learning. It's very similar. Right? This meta-analysis, if you're not familiar with the idea of meta-analysis, it's really just putting a whole lot of studies together to see what the patterns look like statistically. This meta-analysis, which is pretty powerful, says that most of us, if we have to do hard work of thinking, if we can, we'll avoid it. Right? Same as we will avoid, running marathons if we don't have to. Unless you're one of those people that really likes running marathons, Good for you. Some people like doing the hard work of learning too, but even then, we might want to run a marathon, but we don't necessarily want to sit on an exercise bike for an hour. Right? Different areas might require different levels of moving past this unpleasantness. So that's the first thing. The other thing I would tell you is that, and this is a really important part of all of this work, some of the things that we all get told about our learning on the way through are not necessarily what we're starting to understand from the research that we're doing. Let me give you a really good example of this. So what we're often told, and the messages that we get, either explicitly or implicitly, that if you find something difficult, if you get confused about something, it means you're not good enough, right? It means you can't do it. That's not true. We've done lots of work on this. What confusion tells us is that you are actually invested enough in the area to get confused in the first place, and you cannot have an aha moment, right? That's one of the most fun things you can have when you're learning. Oh, I get this now. You don't get that unless you're confused first. It doesn't happen, right? So those two things, one of the most powerful things that you can experience while you're learning, requires you to be confused first. Yet the messages that we often get about what confusion means is that it means that I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I can't do this. That's not what it means at all. If you get confused or you get stuck on something, what it should be telling you is that I should try something different here. Right? If you haven't got any ideas about how to try something different, ask for help. There's no reason you can't ask for help. As you saw with the students who are good at using AI, one of the things that they've gone through a process of doing is asking for help. They ask a machine for help. They ask their peers for help. They ask their teachers for help. That's what a good learner looks like. Right? And again, the research is telling us this over and over. Right? This is good, rigorous. So anybody in the sciences who's thinking, oh, this is not real research. This is lab-based research with randomized control trials, the whole lot. Right? So we've really looked at this very closely. We wrote a review a couple of years ago now where we tried to pull this all together, and difficulties and confusion are a really fundamental part of the learning process. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means maybe you need to try something different. Right? And it's a really powerful message. That's how you get some aha moments. Right? Really core part of learning. So that's one of the, hopefully the first take homes that you'll get from this. It's, if you're finding something difficult, A, it's important, B, you're probably on the right track. C, maybe it means you just need to try something different. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. Right? I get confused all the time. Right? I'm a professor, so it doesn't, right? Confusion is an important part of my learning, and I'm okay with getting stuck and being confused about stuff now, because it means that I'm probably learning something. We also know from this, the work that we've done, is that there is something about the kinds of resources that we use, and this is where AI, we need to be a little bit careful about it, is that sometimes if something feels easier than perhaps it should be, we can be lured into thinking that we understand it better than we do. Right? And as I said, this is something that we all experience. I've experienced this. AI does a really good job of this. Right? AI will explain something to you very clearly, and it might make you feel like you understand it better than you do. A lot of this work comes from testing things with different types of video, right? So we did a lot of work on this a few years ago, looking at different kinds of video resources. What we found is that if we made really glossy, really amazing videos with lots of animations and lots of really, clear, fluent and really engaging material in it, students would watch those videos, and compared to students who watched videos that weren't quite as glossy and high production value, the ones who watched the really fancy ones felt like they had learned far more than they actually had. The students who had watched the ones that were okay generally had a much better calibration of how much they knew compared to how much they thought they knew. Right? So this is where you've got to be careful with AI. Don't let it lure you into thinking that you understand something better than you do, because it's really good at doing that. Right? So you've got to be a little bit careful with that. At the same time, we also don't want you to have learning experiences that are really boring and uninteresting because you're just not going to finish them. So that's the other end of this. There is a sweet spot in there with using AI and other resources to help your learning that is engaging, but is not luring you into thinking that you've got a better handle on it than you actually do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these learning strategies. Like I said, the bottom line in all of this is that the students who are really good at learning are really good at learning with AI. Right? That's not because they're prompt engineers or anything else. It's just because they're good at doing this kind of metacognitive calibration type process. A lot of it, like I said, is about judgment and decision making. So one piece of advice I would give you, and something that I still work on myself, is that I am constantly asking myself, do I really understand this? I'm trying to calibrate how much I understand my level of understanding. If you want to test that, some of you will already be onto this, one of the best ways you can do it is try and explain it to somebody else. That's very quickly going to show you how much you actually understand something, right? So pick on your significant others if they're not studying, right? They don't know as much about your area as you do. Try and explain to them what you're learning. And if you can't do it, then that's a clue that you might need to spend a little bit more time on it. Decision making on the other side of this, one of the biggest risks of this is that if I feel like I understand something better than I actually do, what am I going to do? Stop studying. Right? That's the first thing. I've got this now, I'm going to stop here. So that's the biggest risk, and that's a decision. That's a decision. It's also a decision to say, I'm struggling or I'm stuck here. I can't do this. I'm giving up. If you're stuck or if you're feeling confused, you're probably actually on the right track. Right? One of the things that I've noticed a lot with my students is the ones I really worry about are the ones who haven't invested enough to get confused in the first place, because they haven't engaged enough with the material to go, hold on, this doesn't make sense. Right? Like I said, these are decisions that you make on the way through. So as I said before, there's this constant back and forward. It's really about being more aware of this. Try and make yourself more aware of the way that you're judging how you're going and the decisions that you make on the basis of those judgments. It's a really important skill when you're using AI, right? Because it will tend to tip you one way or another in terms of how you're making those decisions and how you're making those judgments. The more you can be aware of that, the better prepared you are. And the better you will get at being calibrated towards the goal that you're ultimately trying to achieve. Right? These are not difficult things to do, but often, and you might have a think about whether anybody has walked you through this or not, many of the education systems around the world don't tend to focus on this. Right? How many sessions have you been to where somebody has really talked to you about learning how to learn? Right? Often it's not very much, but yet it is such an important skill. And it's not that hard. How am I going here? How can I test my knowledge? How can I make a good decision about where I go next? Right? And keep asking yourself these questions. All right. So a couple of things to sort of wrap up, and then we've got a bit of time for a chat and a Q&A. Difficulty is okay. Finding things hard is important. It's critical. You have to do it. It doesn't mean you can't do this. The people who think that learning is easy are often the ones who don't get it. Right? You're in a university. It's higher education. It's supposed to be hard. Right? Otherwise, everybody would get a degree for nothing. Right? Embrace that. It's okay. It's okay to find it hard. It's important to find it hard. Look for opportunities for you to actually implement your own strategies here. Think about how you can be an active agent in your learning by thinking about how you're going. Where am I going next? Being conscious about those processes, right? Focus on those judgments that you're making about what you understand and what you don't understand, right? Because AI is going to push you in one direction or another, right? Like I said, these are fundamental skills that will allow you to get the most out of this technology. Where am I going next? What role can AI play in helping me to move beyond where I am now? Right? It's becoming aware of these processes that you're doing anyway, right? But often we do it in a very subconscious way. That's how you can have the kind of right basis to, no matter what AI looks like next week, next year, 5 years' time, 20 years' time, if you're still out working in the same area, we have no idea what that's going to look like. We could have AGI, we could have robots working beside us, we don't know. But if you're good at doing these things, you are going to be much better prepared for whatever that future looks like. Right? And more around the world, people are identifying these as kind of the key skills. It's not about prompt engineering. It's about this. Okay, so that's the story that I've got for you. Hopefully that will give you a sense about the things that we're seeing that are really fundamental to good use of AI in learning. And a lot of it goes back to things we knew before about what good learning looks like. Those skills are even more important today than they have been probably ever, because AI has a very specific role that it operates like a peer and not like a tool. So it's even more important for us to understand who we are as learners to get the most out of that. Okay, thank you. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. For my personal use case, I've realized that using AI search engines, like, for example, Bing.com, tends to be more useful than Google these days. Like an instance that the quality of, for my personal opinion, the quality of Google search has gone quite a bit. So that kind of forces people to move towards these AI search engines, and at the end of the day, they summarize information to you. Where I'm going with this is the fact that that's not really reliable either, but you're forced to do so because you don't have a choice at that point. How does one navigate through that? Like, what does one keep struggling on Google search engines? Because that's also a part of learning, how to search on the internet. So like reliance on AI is like kind of in a sense forced, even though one does not want to.
Ooh, great question. So I think we're starting to move into a kind of digital literacy sort of space about how to use search engines well. And obviously there's been a lot of work done on that for some time. But I think your point about a differentiation between kind of AI-driven search results as opposed to the kind of broader search results, I think it depends on what you're trying to do. And this is where a lot of what I've talked about is about understanding where you are and the kind of processes that you need to go through to get to where you need to be. Let me give you an example, right? So let's say I just want a broad sense of, some particular topic, whatever it might be, and I'm quite happy to get the kind of broad stroke of whatever that thing is, right? Now, an AI result is probably fine for that because remember, a lot of these machines are built on averages. So if I'm happy to accept the average, most people say that something happened in 1852 or whatever it might be, then I might be okay with that. But if I'm looking for a restaurant to go to and I don't just want the average and I want something that's going to be nicer or special, maybe I want to cast a wider net. Maybe I don't want a summary of what it is that I'm looking for because I want to get a selection of things that might bring things in from the extremes. So part of this is definitely a digital literacy piece and understanding what the benefits or values are of each of the different kinds of search engines that you might use. But a lot of that, I think, it's a digital literacy thing, but a lot of that also starts from what is my goal here? What is my goal here and what is the knowledge that I need at this time in order to do this task? So I still think it comes back to us, but I think your comment is well made that there is also a very strong digital literacy piece in this that has to slot into that. So thank you for the comment. I hope that's helpful. No answer, but I think, again, it starts from what are we trying to do here, right?
I think it's important, if I may, it's important to understand the source of the data. Like when I search Google, it gives me information, and then there will be references where the data comes from. So of course, if you're a domain expert, you know what this data, who produced a reliable data. So I think it's important for us to know where the data comes from, rather than, it's like fake news. You know, you can get, you know, what do you call that? The Trump's virtual reality.
So I was curious, just like we would teach students how to like use a typewriter, or sorry, a keyboard or a calculator or something as a tool. Do you recommend that when we're designing like lab assignments or other assignments for students that we should encourage them to use AI, force them to use AI, or just kind of leave them to their own devices, and if they use it, you know, okay. What's your thought on that?
Oh boy. I've thought a lot about this for the last couple of years. So some of the work that I've been doing has been thinking about assessment design and security around assessment design and the role that AI plays in that. I ultimately think the bottom line is that educators are best placed to make the decision about what is appropriate or not. However, I would add that I think if, as an educator, you are allowing any use of AI, you have to accept the possibility that the entire task is going to be done by AI. Right? There's no way to know that that is secure or not. So I think what we need to do is ultimately inform educators about what the options are on the table and what the implications are for each. And I would like to think that teachers are best placed to be able to decide what you're going to tell a student about what is appropriate and what's useful or not. So let me give you an example of this, which might help. So as I said before, I teach future teachers. Right? Now, for my students, when they go out and teach in a classroom, they're going to be very busy. They're going to have a lot of things that they need to manage. If they use generative AI to help them with lesson plans, great. I don't care, right? Because that's a useful tool for them to be able to draw in their day-to-day work. But there are other parts of that task that I want to know that they have made decisions about how they're going to do that. Because in 2 years' time, they're going to walk into a classroom and need to teach that lesson. Right. So that I don't want them using AI for, and I want to have a conversation with them about how they think they're going to teach that. So that's how I kind of manage that. So, but I need to make that decision as an educator about what is important about teaching and what are the things that I don't care that they're getting AI to do that actually might be helpful. So rather than there being a blanket rule, unless it's about security, right? If we're talking about secure assessment, we need to make sure that it's secure. But otherwise, I think we want educators to be able to advise our students about what is going to be the most appropriate use or not. I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's actually what I believe. Yeah.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for the presentation. One of the things that you mentioned, I think, was on this idea of, I guess, asking learners, or when you're learning, to have a kind of like a reflexive mindset, this idea of having that sense of self-awareness, which I think is quite hard, because I don't think every student necessarily has the level of reflexivity or openness towards being able to criticize themselves and evaluate their own learning. So was this something that you came across in your work? And if so, what's the best way of cultivating that kind of attitude and mindset around reflection?
It's a great question, and we've grappled with this exact question a lot. The best way is also the most complicated and most difficult way, unfortunately. And I'm talking from my context in Australia, but I understand from conversations that I've had over the last couple of days that the context here is not too different, in that we have spent a lot of time working with secondary schools. And what we've come to understand is that a lot of people, and you might be able to see yourself in this or not, get a fairly crystallized idea about what good learning looks like, usually about 13, 14, 15 years old, right? And our school system is set up in such a way that it reinforces certain ways of learning, often they're around testing and things like that. How much can I cram into my head and regurgitate in an exam, that are not aligned with a lot of the things that I've talked about, right? So if you just want to perform well on an exam, you revise and use flashcards. If there is anybody pre-med here or in medicine, you're already on top of this. Like, you're really good at using flashcards. I know that that's a thing. You can just shortcut a lot of that stuff. But is that the most important learning? So the way to address this, we think, and this is a discussion that is happening across Australia at the moment, is that we need to make a change across all of education. Just doing it, and hopefully this is helpful, what I've talked about with you tonight, but how do we get that message to every student in every educational institution across the whole country. And it requires systemic change to a syllabus and curriculum so that there's more emphasis on the kinds of skills that we're talking about. That's a big, big job. In the meantime, what we're trying to do at my institution is that we're trying to have more and more of the exact kind of discussions that we've had here this evening, right? So that our students have a bit more of a sense of why we do what we do and why those things are important. But that's going to take some time. You know, what has happened in the past, and I alluded to this before, and again, my own university is guilty of this, is that we try to address this problem by running a 1-hour workshop during orientation week. Right? Come along and learn how to learn. It's not enough. Right? It's not enough. So the best way, which to your question, is that we get wholesale change that is coordinated and across whole education sectors, but that's really, really hard. Yeah. So we're just trying to do the best we can in the meantime. Great question. If you come up with a really good answer, let me know. It's a tough one.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. So I kind of have a question that just builds off of what you just said. So one thing I've noticed as an instructor is that, ever since, the proliferation of these large language models, there's been a bit of a regression in terms of assessment modes where a lot of instructors feel that the only way to test students these days is to do pen and paper. Because I remember, I went to school in the mid 2010s, right? And I liked having take-home tests, for example, but I tried doing them with students now, and it goes horrible. Like so much bad faith use, and I'm wondering about your thoughts about this. Like, to what extent is it wise for instructors to go back to the old school way, and what's the future of assessment going to look like?
Ooh, you've got really great questions. This is also a very tough one. So the two interrelated problems that I talked about before, one is about assessment security and the other one is about what does good learning look like in the age of AI. The second one, which goes back to the previous question to some extent, is that our education systems need to be able to catch up with what this technology is able to do. And that's going to take time. So I've been around long enough to remember what education was like before the internet. It took a long time for us to adjust to the sorts of possibilities that were available. I mean, we're running this as a parallel session on Zoom. Like, we were still struggling with that before the pandemic. Like, this has really only become largely normalized, yet a lot of these tools, some of them are a bit patchy, but a lot of these tools were available 20 years ago, right? They were around. We could have used them, but we didn't actually ramp up that capability. So it leaves us with a gap, right? It leaves us with a gap. We have an acute problem at the moment about assessment security. We haven't figured out what does good learning look like in the age of AI piece yet. I don't think anybody anywhere in the world has a really good answer to that. And even if they do, a new model comes out the next day and we have to start thinking about that all over again. So unfortunately, I think you're absolutely right. What has happened is that people are regressing back to assessment methodologies which are not necessarily ideal for all circumstances. As I alluded to before, I'm attempting this year to have conversations with all 250 of my students about their assessment. I'm having nightmares about that, but giving an exam to my students makes no sense, right? I don't really care about whether they can memorize stuff. I care about whether or not they're going to be good teachers, right? And I'm going to get a much better sense from that, from having a conversation with them about who they are as teachers than I'm going to have. But that's hard. Like, we don't have the systems in place to manage that well. So I'm not surprised that a lot of people are going back to exams. I think we'll get there, but it's going to take significant investment over a number of years to figure out, firstly, that answer to what does good learning look like? And then once we have that figured out, then we can come up with better assessment strategies to look for that. Right? But it's a great question and you're absolutely right, it's a big problem. That's the nightmare that I have to go back to when I go back to work on Thursday.
Let's take some questions from WooClap because we do have like 94 participants in Zoom, and I think they have questions.
Yeah, okay. The first one, right? Could you speak about the necessity or value of AI literacy? We talked about digital literacy earlier, but do you think it's important? Including what's under the hood of these AI models?
Great question. Another one that we've grappled with quite a lot for the last 2 years. I think it's important, but I don't think it's the most important thing, right? Part of the reason I say that is because the technology is changing very quickly. So if we spend a whole lot of time helping you and helping other students to understand what this technology actually is, by the time we finish doing that, it's probably going to be something else. So I think, and the comments tonight, I think, really resonate here. I think that there are some of the fundamental skills that we knew that were digital literacy type skills that I think are probably more important broadly than knowing how large language models work. I mean, as I said, I'm not a technical person, but I've got a reasonable understanding about neural networks and Hebbian backpropagation and all the stuff that goes on under the hood. It hasn't actually been that helpful, right? So, but do students need to know something about these things being biased? Yeah. Do we need to know something about these things making mistakes? Yeah. Right. So I think that there are some things that are important, but I'm not sure that that's the most important thing. Like I said, everything that we are seeing suggests that students who are good learners and have good digital literacy are the ones who are figuring out how to do this and doing really well with it. Right. Those seem to be the foundational things. A little bit of AI literacy on top of that is helpful too, but that's not the main thing, I don't think.
Thank you. Next question. Does AI have a role to play in terms of dimensions of learning other than competencies or knowledge, such as motivation, interest, curiosity?
Oh, great question. That one's much harder, right? That one's much harder. As I said on the way through, I think that tipping point that we heard from the students that we interviewed, that they got to a point and didn't want to use technology, they wanted to interact with a human. Anytime, one of the things I didn't mention that what sometimes drives those tipping points is often a motivation thing, right? A machine is not very good at motivating me because I don't see another kind of conscious agent in there that I'm interacting with. Now, some students get a lot of help from that, and we know that there are AIs that do a really good job of supporting well-being and other things like that. But the majority of students that we spoke to said that they wanted that kind of motivational interest component to come more from a human perspective, because there's more kind of empathy that is, and more of a relational component to that they're not getting from a machine. Are machines going to get better at doing this? Yeah. Right? Are some people really happy to have a machine to motivate them? Yeah. But the bulk of the students we spoke to really thought of that as a human dimension, and they wanted that from either peers or teachers. Yeah. That's a great question, though.
We have a couple of questions about the ethical issues associated with AI use, such as environmental issues and copyright issues. So I think they would like to hear your views on that.
They're massive issues. Yeah. I often put a bit of a disclaimer in this. I didn't want to go too far into it tonight because these are complex issues. But absolutely, I think that that's a great comment, and I'm glad that it came up. There are significant ethical problems here. I mean, the other thing we have to keep in mind is that these tools come from a very particular part of the world. There are very particular types of people who are involved in developing these tools who have a very particular worldview, right? So we have to be very careful about the implications of that. Where the data was ripped off from, and many of you will be aware that there are multiple high-profile court cases going on about this at the moment, and the environmental component is scary. Would be the best way that I would describe that. The fact that there are nuclear power plants being brought back online just simply to run large language model databases is kind of frightening. Like, the amount of energy that's being used is a serious implication, and I think that that's, for me, one of the, less so for you as students, but certainly I think about my institution. We have 55,000 students. Is it a responsible thing to do to provide access to all students to AI tools when the potential is that those tools will be used extensively and will create a significant resource and environmental implication as a result of that? That's a serious question that we have to weigh up. And we are having that conversation in Australia at the national level about the appropriateness of those things. So I'm very glad that those things were raised, because I agree they're massive issues that we need to be very clear about.
In your talk, I think there was a slide about, how we should choose what sort of things we should use AI for and what we shouldn't. And somebody wanted to know if there is some kind of a criteria we can use to decide, when we should use AI. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
That's a really hard one, because it comes down to what the particular circumstances are. We've thought about this one a lot as well. We are not of the view that there should be kind of blanket rules about this, Because even if you think about learning in a particular area, so you're learning in one of my areas in psychology, there might be a completely appropriate way of using it to come up with some sort of experimental design, but you move across a week later into something that's related to social psychology, and what was previously a completely appropriate use might look completely inappropriate in that context, because you actually need to understand the social dynamics that are going on in that situation. So I think that it is on both us as teachers and on all of you as students to be mindful of what is going to be useful to help you with your learning, keeping in mind that the learning should be hard, but where you can kind of get the most out of it, but also thinking about that in a very specific way about what it is that you're actually trying to achieve, because it's going to look different depending on what that task is. That's why it's so tricky, I think. In some instances, let me give you a really basic example of this. If you're in a kind of writing course, it might be really important that you know how to spell things or you know how to use grammar. But for my students, unless they're going to be teaching English the following year, I don't care if they're using a grammar check. What I care about is the decisions that they're making and that they're going to be, like I said before, good teachers. So different contexts, different level of appropriateness of using those tools.
I know you've already spoken briefly on that, but we have quite a few questions about how you think teaching and learning and assessment is changing or will change in the age of AI. So maybe you can say a bit about that, maybe especially about assessment. I mean, I have a couple of questions here about how grading might change, for instance.
Oh boy. There's a lot of debate about this at the moment, understandably. There is a pretty strong argument coming from some places in that we should be raising standards, essentially. And you can see that kind of makes sense. Again, I'm going to use my example because I think it's easy for a lot of people to relate to. Am I going to spend my time marking grammar and spelling and punctuation when machines can already do a really good job of helping with that? And that's not kind of the main goal that I'm looking for with my students, right? So do I get rid of all of that as something that I assess and just go for the high level skills about what is important for a teacher to be a good teacher? I think there's an argument for that, right? But I think that's a slow incremental process. So that's something that I think we need to constantly be doing research on to be sure about which direction we're heading with that. And it's, as with some of the answers that I've given here, it's going to look different in different contexts, right? Like I said, in some of them, the basic knowledge that AI might do a good job of producing or replicating might be really fundamental to that discipline, right? If you're working in history, right, you actually need to know the history rather than just let ChatGPT spit it out for you, right? So I think there are some nuanced things that we need to think about there, but perhaps one of those things is that if we're accepting the fact that AI is part of the mix and it's going to help with learning, maybe we need to think about slightly higher standards as a result of that. In terms of the learning and teaching side of it, it's really hard to know, right? I think what I'm getting a sense of globally is that there needs to be a big coordinated research effort to get this right. I don't know anywhere in the world where they've got really good answers to any of this, and where this is all going to head in 15 years is really hard to know. So what I think is important though is that all of us, including all of the students in the room, are all talking about this together, because we all need to learn from each other so that we're not doing the internet all over again and it doesn't take 20 years to get to where we should be, right?
I mean, along this similar lines, what do you think of the role of modeling, the use of AI in the classroom?
Oh, it's huge, huge. So I think modeling is such a critical part of all of this. So if you think about what my job is as a teacher, my job is not just to kind of tell students a whole bunch of stuff, and I realize the irony in that I've done that to you tonight. But I think a big part of my job is not just to know things and to pass that on, but it is to show how I use knowledge in a meaningful way, right? And that includes how I use AI in my own practice. So a story that I told earlier today, which is something that we tried out last year, is that I needed to come up with a new lesson. So I got AI to produce a lesson for me and my team. So we have big classes where we teach 250 students at once in big flat floor spaces. We taught that class exactly the way that AI told us to teach it. Right? We gave it a huge prompt and it spat out a lesson plan, and that was really hard. It was really hard to teach that because the lesson is not the way that we wanted to teach. So what that allowed us to do was have a conversation with our students about saying, here are the ways that you can use AI as a teacher that might be really useful, but be mindful, as per the experience that we've just had, here are the limitations of that. I still need to be the one who walks into the classroom and does the teaching. Right? No matter what the plan says, I'm the one that has to execute that. And that's a really important decision and set of skills that I need in order to be able to do that. So that was our attempt to be able to model to students that it's not just about what this thing produces, but you also need to think about that in a contextualized way for the job that you're going to be doing in the future. So yes, the comment is spot on. I think modeling is such an important part of this. That's going to look very different in different contexts though.
Maybe one more question. Because AI is trained using data that's already out there, do you think this discourages innovation?
I think there's some early evidence of that. And I'm stretching, I'm not ultimately super familiar with it, but I do vaguely remember seeing some evidence that, again, because this thing is based on averages, as we know, if you're relying a lot on AI as a way of kind of trying to project things forward, it will, there's a kind of regression to the mean effect that we would call, is that look more and more like the average. So if the idea is that you want to push the boundaries beyond something and create something new, then perhaps something that is bringing you back to the average is not necessarily going to allow you to do that. But again, I think that comes down to being aware of what your own limitations are and what the limitations of the machine are in relation to that. Right. So it's a complicated situation in that it can actually be helpful to get you a sense of what's already out there, but you probably need to be able to move beyond that to particularly if you're trying to create new knowledge.
Maybe, do we have time for one last question? Yes. Somebody wanted to know if you think AI will mitigate the effects of a competitive educational culture, which is very true in Singapore.
Let me put this in a way that I think is kind of a bit more kind of broad here. What I hope happens is that AI allows us to have more sophisticated, nuanced conversations about what good learning is. We probably should have been having these conversations before, let's face it. But I think that this has put us in a situation where we now have to, right? And there are certain systems, and I understand that there are systems in place here that are not necessarily, the same is true in Australia, that are not necessarily aligned with what we understand about what the best learning should be and should look like. And hopefully AI will allow us to have more of those conversations so that we can do new things and we can address some of the things that we know have been an issue for a while.